I'm Steven Germishuizen, and I've been working for 15 years actually with the plantation and forestry sector around various environmental aspects, and quite a lot with forest certification. And my last 5 years have been working with the Sandy Grasslands program, looking at conservation strategies within forestry. We're going to take a bit of a break from science right now and deal with much more pragmatic issues. And what I've been... Sorry, how do I advance this thing? Oh, there we go. What I've been tasked to do by WWF is to engage with the conservation sector so that they can become more involved with forestry certification in general, to assist the plantation industry both with compliance, and we must look for opportunities for the conservation sector to get involved. There's a lot of opportunities, and so what I'm hoping to do is really this presentation to be a starting point and an invitation to the conservation sector to start getting involved. And hopefully I'll be able to provide you with some entrance points into certification. Okay, I'm going to be looking at 4 things. And really, why are we bothering with this? What does the plantation sector got to offer to conservation? What assets are out there worth conserving? I'm going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of forest certification so that you can understand how it works. Then quite practically, have a look and see if you're on a certified plantation, what do you expect to see? What does certification demand of plantation owners? And then lastly, how can the conservation sector get involved? Right. This is just a map showing where forestry is situated. Forestry is about a forestry estate of about 2 million hectares, of which about 1.3 million of it is actually planted trees, and the rest is infrastructure or open areas, semi-natural or natural habitat. And the black areas there are the plantation forestry sector, and this demonstrates, if you look at the blue areas, those are areas in South Africa with rainfall higher than 800 mils. So plantation forestry occupies 10% of those areas in South Africa that have more than 800 mils of rain. So forestry sitting in high water production areas. Similarly, most of the forestry, the national forestry estate, sits in the Mputuland, Pondoland, Albany biodiversity hotspot, and quite a lot of it also falls into the Cape Floristic region. So forestry is occupying land with very high biodiversity values, and we need to understand that when we interact with forestry. What's also notable is that during assessments for the Biodiversity Stewardship Program, the ecologists found that a very large proportion of the really threatened grassland types were on forestry land in these areas, and some of the very best examples of those vegetation types were on forestry land. So forestry effectively in some of these really transformed habitats are like gene banks for a lot of rare species, so they must be valued. Forestry companies have taken cognizance of this, and over many years they've been doing quite a lot of work to identify and list and tabulate what they're finding on their properties. So this is some of the work that Mondi's been doing, looking at the different numbers of different taxes found and the percentage of species of special concern that are likely to occur in those areas that are actually occurring on Mondi property. So if you look at amphibians, 21% of species of special concern, these are endemic species or IUCN threatened species, can be found on Mondi plantations in those areas where those species are likely to occur. So in many of these taxes, plantations, for example, just on Mondi land, contribute significantly to the conservation of those species. Similarly, SAPI's been doing a lot of work looking at mammals on their property and other taxa, but the mammal data is particularly interesting, this camera trap data that's just coming to the fore now. On this graph, they're showing 27 different mammal species and abundance from 10 SAPI plantations in the KZN area. And the latest figures, they were telling me they found over 32 mammal species. And quite interestingly, things like brown hyena were found in the Karkloof. So there's some really remarkable things that are being found on plantation. It's really worth working with them in terms of conserving these species. Okay, so what we really need to understand, though, when we're assessing and thinking about the ecological contribution that forestry makes, it's not sensible just to be looking at the stand of trees. We really need to be taking a look at the landscape perspective. And a lot of the studies and assessments done of forestry have considered the impact of the stand of trees. But we've got to look at the landscape level, of the entire landscape that forestry occupies, to understand the biodiversity contribution that forestry can make. The other sort of point of departure that we need to appreciate is that we're all using forest products, find them quite essential in certain situations, and the demand for forest products is increasing radically. This is data taken from a WWF study looking at projecting the consumption of wood products over until 2030, and there's a tremendous demand for forest products coming up. And the other thing that I really want to point out is that the management of plantations is particularly important in the quality of services that they're going to deliver. And we really need to be looking at how we can influence this management, and I'm hoping to present to you how important certification is in influencing management, or how important it can be. So if you manage an estate well, the quality and quantity of services can be quite extensive. And forestry started to look at these services and start quantifying and assessing their forestry estates for these services. Some interesting stuff and interesting applications starting to come out of this work. This, for example, is work that's been done on sappi plantations that's looking at a range of services and then looking at scenarios. For example, the scenario that they're testing now is what effect does it have on the contribution or the generation of all these services if they switch from pine to gum, or if their grasslands are managed particularly well or left to degrade. And they're looking at the impact on services. So that's interesting work that you need to be aware of. Okay, so that's giving you the picture of why we want to work with forestry, why we're interested. But now, what is forest certification? What can it do? And you need to understand some basic points about how forest certification actually works. Okay, it's a green label, and there's millions of them, and for a green label to work, you have to be able to differentiate yourself in the market. And any of these green labels depend on the market making the correct choices. But they also depend on a premium being paid for that product, and the premium must be sufficient to offset the cost of externalizing your environment and social costs. So companies that are managing the environment and managing the social costs of it as well should be paid from that premium, and the premium has to be enough. And the jury's still out there whether certification globally has delivered this. Studies have shown that people pay lip service to the fact that they will choose and pay extra premium for green products, but when you look at products moving on the shelf, it's not the case. They don't do what they say. They don't put their money where their mouth is. So, and the other thing that we need, the jury's still out on, is whether forest certification is delivering better management. No one has measured this in a scientific way, but I think we shouldn't let that bother us, what internationally is happening, but rather look at the opportunities that forestry certification presents to the conservation sector to influence management. Okay, so it works simply like this. There needs to be certification on the source, at the timber source, so that the actual forestry estate gets certified for sound management, and then there needs to be certification on the traceability or the chain of custody. And that's what this represents. So there'll be at each point of sale and at each processor, an inspection has to be done to make sure the integrity of that product, the traceability of it is assured. Okay, the only certification system operating in South Africa is the Forest Stewardship Council, it started certifying timber in 1994 and is now 20 years old, and they've certified 185 plus million hectares. It seems to be going very well, and everyone's very excited, but there's some severe challenges facing the FSC. The one challenge is that most of this timber sits in the global north and are boreal and temperate forests that were really quite well managed, and most of the forest destruction and problems are in the south and in the tropical forests where certification hasn't had much impact. And the other real challenge facing the FSC is that small and medium scale and small scale forestry smallholders aren't able to access it. So most of that certified area that is in the hands of global multinational companies. FSC is having to face this challenge very seriously. The danger is that FSC starts looking like a trade barrier for small operations and for the global south. Okay, quickly, how does FSC actually work? The FSC is really a consensus-based organization in the extreme. It is a general assembly of members. This thing is a general assembly of members, and these members belong to different chambers, environmental, social, and economic, and each of those chambers is split to north and south. And these, really, the membership is what determines the direction of policy. There's a board of directors which make things happen, and there's a director general. Kim Carstensen is the current one, and he runs the ships. The FSC themselves do not do the auditing of the certified organizations. They delegate this responsibility to certification bodies, of which there are two in South Africa. There's SGS, the Qualifor, and then there's the Soil Association, the Woodmark label, which is currently being managed or being run by South African Bureau of Standards. They do the auditing, and this is just a sample of certified companies in South Africa. Most of the forestry companies are certified. Where there's a problem is small and medium scale growers, and the farmers and the communities have had finding it very hard to access forest certification. Right, so the next chapter is what does forestry, what does the FSC require a certified forest or plantation to look like? Right, there's 10 FSC principles and 56 criteria and a plethora of indicators. Quickly, I'm going to go through these. Principle 1 really deals with compliance with all national laws that pertain to forestry. Principle 2, workers' rights. We look at indigenous people's rights, community relations, benefits from the forest, looks at sort of things like multiple resource utilization. Principle 6, environmental values and impacts. I'm going to go into in a little bit of detail. Principle 7 is about management planning. Principle 8, monitoring and assessment, and this is important because I think our conservation partners can help us play a big role in monitoring and assessment. Principle 9 deals with high conservation values, and this deals with really conservation values of almost a global significance and deals with things which aren't captured in Principle 6. Principle 10 is like a catch-all around implementation of management. Important thing to realize about the FSC is that forests and plantations are considered to be forests, and I know that that's not popular, and it's not popular among most of the membership actually at the moment, and there's a split in the FSC, but it's for various reasons probably going to remain that way. There won't be a separate standard for plantations. The FSC are very strong on making sure that scale, intensity, and risk are applied to auditing, in the hope that small-scale operations and different intensity operations aren't excluded from the FSC, but it hasn't really been that successful. But there are projects or work to sort that out. And the important thing is that these standards have to be adapted for national conditions, and they're adapted by changing the indicators. Sorry, keep doing that. Okay. All right, so now I want to quickly look practically at what some of those Principle 6 things mean on the ground, what conservation people should look out for, and where they possibly can be of assistance. Okay, Principle 6 deals with the management of the impacts of the operations on the environment, and it's important to understand this fact that you've got to, the certified organization needs to assess the environmental values on their property, but also outside of the management unit, outside of their property that may be affected by their management activities. So they need to be thinking about downstream users and neighbors and what impact that they're having. They need to understand the risk of their impacts on the environmental values, and they need to take preventative measures on that. And I'm just going to show you some practical aspects that we look at when we talk about this. Things like planting very, very steep slopes and all the dangers associated with that. Things like using heavy machinery on steep slopes and the impact that it has on soils. Wildfires can have a tremendous impact on those values. And then things like what happens to the plantation residues that are left on site after the harvesting operation. Important that the best practice is not to burn those, but if they burn, very strictly conditions on how they're burnt and where they're burnt and what the slope aspects are. These are all soil conservation measures. Alien plant management is obviously a huge issue. And what plantation companies should really have in place is systematic alien control plans that have follow-ups, that make provision for follow-ups, but that also have an ecological basis for deciding on where they put their resources, so that they're attacking the most important places for their operations. Now, Forestry South Africa has promulgated a set of environmental guidelines, and these were produced a very long time ago, and currently they're under review. And I'm sort of thinking now that maybe we should make an opportunity for the conservation sector to input into to the review of the environmental guidelines. It could be hugely valuable. For example, while I was working within the grasslands program, we wrote grassland management guidelines, which then will be inserted into the review. But I think it would be really a great opportunity for the conservation sector to input into how management takes place. Okay, another set of criteria under 6 is the protection of rare and threatened species and their habitats, and the protection of representative samples of native ecosystems, and the restoration of ecosystems. Those are all explicitly required by the FSC. What does Forestry in South Africa do about that? What Forestry's been doing is trying to grapple and get an understanding of the relative conservation values of their land holdings. And we worked with Forestry Wild within the grasslands program to develop tools to do this. And they were simple tools that really used systematic conservation planning, forestry data, and produced fine-scale maps of plantation estates that would show the relative conservation values. So in this particular example that was done, the areas that are in red here were particularly important for conservation, and the forestry managers can then target those areas for special management or understand how they need to manage those areas. Now also the FSC is very explicit about getting experts involved and getting stakeholders involved. So the FSC actually requires plantation managers to interact with conservation authorities and other experts in getting management advice for these areas. And they do that in many cases, but it's just nice to be aware that that's actually required. In South Africa, we're sitting in one of the most biodiverse temperate places in the world, and there's just so many threatened species that occur on forestry land that they cannot be responsible for identifying every threatened taxon. But what they have been focusing on is charismatic species, keystone species, and species that are focus of conservation programs like the oribes and cranes and these sort of things. And it's just interesting that forestry, for example, one of the forestry companies, Amatola forestry companies, working with EWT to conserve the Amatola toad, and there's a tremendous amount of work. This species, Lucaspermum gerardi, is in one of the community forestry sites that we're trying to get certified. And so there's a lot of work going on there. But this is really where they can get a lot of assistance, and are getting assistance from Ezemvelo and EWT and other organizations. Control of hunting, fishing, and trapping is expressly. Can I just shoot through, because my last slide is very short. The problem that forestry has quite extensively is dog hunting on their land. And this is really the type of thing that requires an integrated and landscape approach with many landholders and stakeholders to get right. And forestry is moving in that direction. It's just nice to be aware that they need to be doing that. Protection and restoration of natural watercourses and riparian zones are clearly a forestry issue. Forestry is developed with partners, developed delineation guidelines, and they need to be implementing them, and we need to be checking that during checking that and following up. Forestry's done a lot of work with Samways and Pryke and these sort of people in developing the theory around corridors and how important they are to biodiversity conservation. this is to be very much encouraged. The last principle that they deal with, I'll deal with very quickly. It's about Principle 9, high conservation values. And the way that forestry has been dealing with this largely is to interact with the biodiversity stewardship programs and declare these areas that are particularly important as formal protected areas. And there's several examples. During the grasslands program, we assisted with Ezemvelo and Mpumalanga biodiversity stewardship program, 37 sites into the stewardship program. A lot of them have been already declared. That's totaling about 48,000 hectares. There's another 50,000 hectares of potential stewardship sites which were really identified on forestry land. This is an example of the Excelsior protected environment of Mondi's. Forest side is a private-owned reserve owned by Brian Armour. The Hogsback protected environment is, we're working towards that with Amatola Forestry Company, and there's Mukubala Nature Reserve, which is owned by Elizabeth Parker up in Mpumalanga. So this is the most important slide, so you can't stop me yet, but it's going to go quite quickly. How can conservation organisations get involved? Okay, what you've got to understand is that throughout the FSC standard, it talks about engaging with stakeholders. It's absolutely imperative. Forestry companies are required to proactively engage with stakeholders, contact them and elicit their opinions on a large range of issues. So if you're not being engaged with, you need to make a noise, and I'll show you how to do that. If you see a problem on forestry, or you want to engage with forestry because you see you can make a contribution, how do you know who the landowner is? You might pass a forestry state and want to comment on it. You should be able to get that information from Forestry South Africa. You are allowed to, and every single certified organisation has to have a summary, a publicly available summary of their management plan, which includes key aspects around environmental management, conservation, threatened species, high conservation values. You can request that at any time of a certified organisation, and they need to provide it for you, and with in mind to contribute and assist. Approach the organisation directly if you want to contribute, criticise, or got issues with them. They're obliged to listen, record, and respond and address your issues. If you're wondering if someone's certified or wondering on the status of their certificate and wish to see the latest FSC reports, you go on that webpage and the reports will be there, and the certification status you can verify. If you've got no joy at all with any of these avenues, you can contact the certification bodies directly and lodge a complaint if there's issues that you wish to complain about. But you really encourage, if you approach a certification body before actually approaching the organisation, the certification body should be saying to you, go back and approach the organisation, then come to us. It's meant to work at the organisational level. If you still have no joy, you can approach the Southern African FSC Director, Chris Birchmore, and there's his email address. If you want to comment on the development of FSC standards, the FSC standard is in the process of being modified, the South African standard. It's going to have to be sent to stakeholders for comment. Be sure that if you get that, you must get that document, and you must make a comment and make an input, and you can join the FSC. The FSC has 800 and something members, organisational and individual, and that's where you can have the biggest say. Last thing before I thank you is that you can contact me if there's anything you want to know. Addresses, contact people. Sorry, it's very, very small. Most important thing. You can contact me at steve@aes.co.za, steve@aes, and I can give you any information that you need to know. And I sit on the Forestry's Environmental Management Committee, so I can also discuss issues that you have with them. Thank you. Thanks to WWF for assistance with this work. Any comments, questions, or...